She arrived in Montana with 3 broken ribs, a trunk full of lies she hadn't told yet, and a name that didn't feel like hers anymore. Adelaide Mercer had buried 1 husband, survived his family's accusations, and crossed half a continent to marry a stranger. Because a stranger, she figured, couldn't possibly be worse than what she was running from. She was wrong about a lot of things that autumn, but she was right about that. If this is your first time here, welcome. Stay until the end, because this story doesn't go where you think it will. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The woman who arrived in October. Bah! The train from Billings smelled like coal smoke and damp wool, and Adelaide Mercer sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and her jaw set so tight that the left side of her face had started to ache somewhere around the Wyoming border. She had been holding herself like that for 3 days, rigid, controlled, taking shallow breaths because deep ones still pulled at the healing fractures along her right side in a way that made her eyes water. She did not allow herself to cry on the train. She had a rule about that. Outside the window, Montana rolled past in long waves of brown and gold. Autumn grass bent low by a wind she could not yet hear, but could see in the way everything leaned the same direction, everything pushed, everything angled away from something coming. The sky was enormous. That surprised her. She had read about the western sky in letters her father's clients had sent back east, but reading about a thing and sitting underneath it were entirely different experiences. Philadelphia's sky existed in patches and strips, carved up by roof lines and church steeples and the constant press of buildings shouldering each other for space. This sky had no edges she could find. It went on until she felt dizzy looking at it, and she turned back to the window frame and fixed her gaze on something closer. A fence line, a creek, a stand of cottonwood trees dropping the last of their yellow leaves. She had $34 in her purse, a carpet bag on the rack above her head, a trunk in the luggage car that contained most of what remained of her previous life, her father's law books, a few good dresses, the marriage certificate from her union with Gerald Mercer that she had not yet decided whether to keep or burn. She was 29 years old. She felt older than that, and younger, and sometimes both at once. The agreement had been made through correspondence. A mutual acquaintance, a woman named Mrs. Clara Dunning, who ran a respectable placement service out of Denver, had facilitated the introduction between Adelaide and a rancher named Colton Reeves of Harlan County, Montana Territory. The letters had been brief and practical. Mr. Reeves had written that he had a working cattle ranch, a 3-room house that could accommodate a second person, and a need for someone capable of managing the domestic operations of a working property. He had written that he was 36, that he had no children, that his previous marriage had ended with his wife's death 4 years prior. He had written that he expected honesty and fair treatment to go in both directions, and that he did not expect love, only a workable arrangement between 2 people who both needed something they could not find alone. Adelaide had written back that she was a widow, that she was healthy. She'd had to pause for a long time over that word, her pen hovering, that she had no family obligations, and that she was capable of hard work. She had not mentioned the ribs. She had not mentioned Gerald's family. She had not mentioned the year she had spent in her brother-in-law's house after Gerald's death, treated less like a widow and more like a piece of evidence in an ongoing trial. Mrs. Dunning had arranged the rest. Adelaide had sold Gerald's pocket watch, the one his family had never thought to demand back, for enough to cover the train fare, and then she had packed her trunk in the middle of the night so that no one in the Mercer household would see her leaving, and she had walked to the station in the dark with her carpet bag and her $34 and her carefully held breath. That had been 11 days ago. The train pulled into the Harlan station at 2:30 in the afternoon. Adelaide stood, gathered her carpet bag, and allowed herself one full breath before she stepped off the platform. A real breath, the kind that hurt, the kind that reminded her she was still alive and therefore still capable of making mistakes. She thought that was probably a useful thing to remember. The station was small. A wooden platform, a ticket window, a bench where an old man was asleep under his hat. 3 horses tied at the post, 2 men talking by a wagon loaded with fencing supplies, a woman in a dark coat waiting near the far end of the platform, though the woman turned out to be waiting for someone else and walked away almost immediately, leaving Adelaide standing alone with her carpet bag and the enormous Montana sky pressing down on all of it. She had been standing there for perhaps 3 minutes, wondering if she had made a catastrophic error, when she heard boots on the platform boards behind her. "Mrs. Mercer," she turned. The man who stood there was not what she had constructed from his letters. She had built him in her mind the way you build anyone you can't yet see, assembled from small details and educated guesses, adjusted and readjusted until something plausible emerged. She had expected someone rougher, she thought, or perhaps more assured of himself in the aggressive way that men who owned land often were. Gerald had been like that, polished on the surface, deeply certain of his own importance underneath. Colton Reeves was tall and lean in the way that outdoor work makes a man lean, with a face that had been weathered into its permanent form somewhere in his early 30s and hadn't changed much since. Brown hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that needed shaving. His hat was dusty and his coat was clean, which told her something about what he considered worth the effort. He was looking at her with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite neutral, something careful in it. Something that suggested he was also adjusting an expectation. "Yes," she said. "Adelaide Mercer." "Colton Reeves." He didn't extend his hand immediately, which she noticed. Most men reached out without thinking, as though the handshake were automatic, obligatory. He waited a half-second, giving her the choice. Then he offered his hand, and she took it briefly, and he let go without holding on. "Train was late," he said. "A few hours out of Billings. Something with the track." He nodded. "You eat anything today?" The question startled her enough that she didn't answer immediately, and he seemed to take that as an answer in itself. "There's a place across the street does a decent meal," he said. "I thought we could sit before we drive out to the property. It's about 2 hours by wagon. Gets cold fast once the sun drops." She looked at him. She was trying to find the angle, the control buried inside the courtesy, the way Gerald had used to ask questions that were not really questions but demands with softer grammar. "Wouldn't you like to stay in tonight, Adelaide? Wouldn't you prefer to wear the blue dress?" Colton Reeves just looked back at her, patient, a little tired around the eyes, waiting. "Yes," she said finally. "I'd appreciate that." The restaurant was called May's, and it occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building that also served as a boarding house. A woman who was presumably May moved between the 4 occupied tables with the efficient, unsentimental speed of someone who had been feeding people for decades and had stopped finding it remarkable. Colton ordered coffee and a beef stew, without consulting a menu. Adelaide ordered the same, because it was easier than thinking. They sat across from each other at a table near the window, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I should tell you something," Adelaide said. She had rehearsed this on the train. There was a version of this conversation she had planned carefully, measured, controlled, presenting information in the order that made her seem least damaged. "My health. I describe myself as healthy in my letter, and that will be true. But I had an accident some months ago. I'm still recovering. It won't affect my ability to manage a household, but you should know that I'm not at full capacity yet, physically." Colton wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her steadily. "What kind of accident?" She had planned for this question too. "A fall," she said, which was technically true. He was quiet for a moment. "Ribs?" She blinked. "How?" "The way you breathe," he said, without any particular inflection, "and the way you held yourself on the platform, guarded on the right side." Adelaide looked down at her coffee. Something in her chest tightened that had nothing to do with her ribs. "3, she said quietly. 3 fractured. They're healing. The doctor in Philadelphia said another 4 to 6 weeks before I'd be at full capacity." "Okay," he said. She looked up. "Okay?" "I've got a ranch hand who broke 2 ribs last spring. He was back to half duty in 5 weeks. He took a drink of his coffee. "You can take whatever time you need. I'm not running a workhouse." She didn't know what to do with that. She sat with it the way you sit with something that doesn't fit the shape of the room you've arranged in your head, something that forces you to rearrange. "The arrangement still stands," he added. "The terms don't change because you're healing." "You don't know me," Adelaide said. It came out sharper than she intended. He didn't flinch. "No, I don't. But I made an agreement, and I keep those. May set their stew down in front of them and disappeared again. Outside, the October light was thinning toward evening, and Adelaide watched a horse and rider pass in the street, unhurried, the horse's breath fogging in the cooling air. "I appreciate that," she said at last, meaning it, which surprised her. Bob. The drive to the Reeves Ranch took closer to 2.5 hours because they stopped twice. Once because a section of the road had washed out and they had to find a way around through a field, and once because one of the horses threw a shoe and Colton had to check the situation before deciding the animal could manage the remaining distance at a slower pace. He did not curse or slam things around. He got down from the wagon, checked the horse's hoof methodically, wiped his hands on his trousers, climbed back up, and said they'd need to take it slow the rest of the way. Adelaide sat with her carpet bag on her knees and watched the land change as they moved away from town. The road climbed and wound through low hills covered in dry grass and sage, crossed a wooden bridge over a creek that was running clear and cold, and then descended into a wider valley where the mountains to the west were already pulling the dark down off their shoulders. She could see cattle on the slopes, dozens of them, dark shapes against the pale grass. And farther on, the outlines of buildings. A barn, a smaller outbuilding, and a house set back from the road behind a fence that needed painting. It was not beautiful in any landscaped, curated way. It was beautiful the way working things are beautiful. Worn and particular and utterly without pretense. The ranch hand who met them at the barn was a young man named Pete Halverson, maybe 22, with a gap between his front teeth and the kind of perpetual sunburn that fair-skinned people get when they spend their lives outside. He helped with the horses without being asked and touched the brim of his hat in Adelaide's direction. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Halverson," she said back. He looked mildly surprised to be called that. She filed that away. The house was small but not cramped, a kitchen that doubled as the main living space, with a wood stove and a table and 4 chairs and shelves along one wall holding canned goods, and 2 lanterns and a coffee tin and a row of books that she did not expect. A narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms. Colton showed her to the larger of the 2 without ceremony. "I took out the furniture you'd want to replace," he said, standing in the doorway. There wasn't much. The bed frame's solid. Mattress is new. The room was sparse. The bed, a small chest of drawers, a hook on the wall for clothes, a single window facing north. On the windowsill, someone had left a small bunch of dried wildflowers in a tin cup. She looked at it. "Pete's wife sent those," Colton said, and his voice shifted slightly, became briefly uncertain. She said it was a nice thing to do. I don't know if you'd want them there or not." "I'd like them there," Adelaide said. He nodded once and stepped back from the doorway. "I'll get your trunk from the wagon." She stood alone in the room and listened to his boots cross the floorboards back toward the front door, and she pressed her hand carefully against her right side, feeling the slow, deep ache of the healing fractures, the body's constant reminder of what it had survived. And she thought, I don't know what this is. I don't know what this place is. But it doesn't feel like what I left. That was not the same as feeling safe. She knew better than to confuse the two. October gave way to the first cold snap of November, and Adelaide learned the particular shape of the Reeves Ranch the way you learn anything real. Not all at once, not from an explanation, but through the accumulation of small daily facts. She learned that the water pump in the kitchen was reliable, but needed priming on cold mornings. That the wood stove burned through birch faster than pine, but heated more evenly. That Pete Halverson arrived before dawn and ate breakfast in the kitchen if she offered it, and always wiped his boots before coming in, and said thank you, ma'am, for every cup of coffee with a sincerity that seemed genetic, as though he had been born grateful. That Colton kept a ledger in the kitchen drawer and updated it every Sunday evening by lamplight, going over the numbers with a focused quietness that made her think he had done this alone for a very long time. She learned the sound of the house at night, which boards creaked in the hallway, how the wind came around the north side of the barn in a particular key, how the cattle were quieter than she expected, their presence mostly felt rather than heard, a low, warm mass of life out in the dark. She learned that Colton did not ask questions he didn't need answered. That was the thing about him that unsettled her the most in those first weeks. Not his silence, which was comfortable rather than cold, but the precision of his restraint. He noticed things. She could tell he noticed. the way her movements sometimes paused, the way she startled at unexpected sounds, the careful calculation that went into every decision she made as though she were always measuring some distance between herself and the nearest exit. He noticed, and he did not mention it, and he did not rearrange his behavior to demonstrate that he had noticed, which would have been its own kind of pressure. He just continued, going about the work of the ranch, coming in for meals, sometimes sitting with his ledger or with one of the books from the shelf, occasionally asking her opinion on practical matters, whether she thought the kitchen layout was workable, whether she'd want a vegetable garden put in come spring, whether the supply list he'd made for his next trip to town was missing anything obvious. He treated her like someone whose opinion was worth considering. It was such a small thing, and it kept catching her sideways. One afternoon, about 2 weeks in, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her father's law books spread around her, 3 heavy volumes of property and land law that she had carried across the country because she had not been able to leave them, because they were the last things her father had touched regularly, and also because she found, in their dense legal language, a kind of clarity that the rest of the world rarely offered. She had been reading the same passage for 20 minutes when she heard Colton come in from outside. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the books. "Those yours?" "My father's," she said. "He was a land attorney in Philadelphia." Colton was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know anything about property law, survey records?" She looked up. "Some. He taught me. He didn't have sons. He taught me what he could." A pause. "Why?" "I've had some trouble," he said carefully, as though testing the weight of the words before committing to them. "With a county official named Crow, Elias Crow. He's claiming a portion of the south pasture, about 40 acres, that's been part of this property for 15 years. Says there was a survey error in the original deed. His survey puts the boundary line 200 yards east of where it's always been." Adelaide felt something shift in her attention, a familiar sharpening, the thing that happened when a problem had a structure she could engage with. "Do you have the original survey documents?" "In the box in my bedroom, yes." "And the deed of transfer, the one from when you purchased the property?" "Yes." "Can I see them?" He looked at her for a moment. She could not entirely read his expression. There was something in it she didn't have a name for yet, something between relief and caution. "I can get them," he said. He brought the box and set it on the table, and Adelaide moved her father's books to make room, and they sat across from each other while she went through the documents one by one. The original survey dated 1863. The deed of transfer, 1874. A subsequent county survey from 1876 that she studied for a long time, her finger moving across the legal descriptions, the metes and bounds, the reference to the creek as a natural boundary marker. "There," she said, and turned the document so he could see. Colton leaned over to look. He was close enough that she could smell the outdoors on him, cold air and horse, and the specific dry scent of autumn work. "The 1876 survey uses the East Fork of Harlan Creek as the eastern boundary marker," she said. "But the creek changed course. There was a flood. Do you remember when, in the past 10 years, a significant one?" "Spring of 75, he said immediately. "Hell of a runoff year, moved the East Fork almost 200 yards west of its old channel." "Then the survey marker moved with it," Adelaide said. "Whoever did Crow's survey used the current creek bed. But the legal description in your original deed references the historical creek bed, and there should be records of where it ran before the flood. County records, other surveys from before 75, any land transaction that referenced the creek's prior course." She sat back. "If you can establish where the creek ran before the flood, you can demonstrate that Crow's survey is using an invalid reference point. The boundary hasn't moved, the creek has." Colton stared at the document. Then he looked at her with an expression that was direct and a little stunned. "How do you know that?" "I watched my father argue a nearly identical case in 1869, Adelaide said. "He won." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences she was used to. Not heavy, not loaded with something unspoken and threatening. Just full. Like a room that's been waiting for furniture. "I'll need to ride to the county seat," Colton said finally. "The historical records, if they exist, would be there." "You'd want someone who knows what they're looking for in those records," Adelaide said. He was quiet for a moment. "Would you come?" She had not expected the question, or rather, she had expected it to be phrased differently, to be assumed rather than offered. I'll need you to come. You'll want to come, not, would you come? Yes, she said. I would. They rode to Harlan County seat 3 days later, on a morning that started clear and turned gray by noon. Pete stayed to manage the cattle. The road was harder than it looked, rutted from recent rain, the horses picking their way carefully in places, and they rode mostly in a companionable quiet that Adelaide would not have predicted 2 weeks earlier. She had started to notice something about riding alongside Colton, the absence of performance. Gerald had been a man who performed himself constantly, who was always aware of how he appeared and adjusted accordingly, charming with people he needed to charm, dismissive with people he didn't, and at home, in private, something else entirely. Colton just was. He didn't seem to be managing an impression of himself. He looked at the land as they rode through it with an attention that was genuine, not theatrical, and when he spoke it was because he had something to say. Not because he was filling silence he found threatening. How long had your husband been sick? He asked, somewhere around the second hour. It was not an aggressive question. He asked it the way he asked everything, direct but with space around it. Gerald's heart condition, she said, keeping her voice level. It was sudden. The family had no idea it was as serious as it was. That was true. He died 7 months ago. Colton nodded. Hard thing to lose a husband suddenly. She thought about Gerald on the morning he died. She thought about the staircase. She thought about what she had felt in the moments after his family had arrived and looked at her and decided she was the explanation. She thought, hard thing doesn't quite cover it. Yes, she said. My wife, Colton said after a moment. Sarah. She was sick for over a year before she died. That's a different kind of hard. You have time to prepare and it turns out time doesn't actually help as much as everyone says it will. Adelaide looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, his face settled into something quiet and honest and not at all theatrical about its grief. No, she agreed, it doesn't. They rode in silence for a while after that. It was a different silence than before, a little more weighted, a little more real, the kind that only happens between people who have told each other something true. The county records office was a single room off the back of the land registrar's building, staffed by a clerk named Emmett, who was clearly delighted to have visitors, and equally clearly had not organized anything in recent memory. The files were arranged by a system that Emmett explained at length, and that Adelaide decoded in about 30 seconds as approximately chronological with significant exceptions. She spent 4 hours in that room. Colton brought her coffee at some point. He sat in the corner with what appeared to be genuine patience and let her work, answering her questions when she had them, and otherwise staying quiet. She went through surveys dated 1863 through 1876, cross-referencing the descriptions of Harlan Creek's course with property transaction records that used the creek as a reference point. She found what she was looking for in a deed from 1872, a property sale that included a hand-drawn diagram of the creek's course as it existed at that time, marked with distances from known fixed points, a distinctive rock outcropping, the corner post of a neighboring fence line, a particular bend in the road. She traced the diagram's measurements onto a fresh piece of paper, mapped them against the current survey Crow had submitted, and found the discrepancy sitting there plain as a signature. The original eastern boundary of the south pasture, she said, spreading her traced map on the table in front of Colton, runs approximately 210 yards east of where Crow's survey places it. Here and here, she pointed. These fixed points still exist. The rock formation is described in 3 separate documents from the 1860s. If it's still there, it is, Colton said, leaning over the map. His shoulder was near hers. I ride past it every week. Then you can demonstrate the boundary location independent of the creek's current course. She sat back. Crow's survey is either incompetent or deliberate. Either way, it's legally insufficient to support the boundary adjustment he's claiming. Colton straightened up and looked at her for a long moment. I had a lawyer in Billings look at this in September, he said. He said it was complicated, that it might take years in court. A lawyer in Billings who doesn't know this county's records as well as he should, Adelaide said, perhaps more firmly than she intended. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be. You're right, Colton said simply. What do we do with this? She thought about her father sitting across his desk from her when she was 15, walking her through a similar case. A legal argument is only as strong as the documentation behind it. Addie, gather the evidence first, then build the argument around what you can prove. We get copies of these documents, she said, everyone I've marked. Then you need to file a formal counter-challenge to the survey with the Territorial Land Office, not just the county, because Crow has influence at the county level. The Territorial Office in Helena is the right venue. She paused. And you'll want to do it quickly. If Crow knows you've been in these records, he'll know, Colton said quietly. Emmett out front will tell someone, and Harlan's a small place. Adelaide nodded. Then we ask Emmett to make copies today. Now. Colton looked at her with that expression she was still learning, the one she didn't have a name for yet, that was neither relief nor caution, but something in between, something that looked almost like recognition. All right, he said. They left the records office 2 hours before sunset with copies of 6 documents folded carefully in Adelaide's carpet bag. The ride home was mostly dark, the stars coming out over the mountains in a way that had no equivalent in Philadelphia, the cold sharpening around them as they moved. Colton lit the wagon lantern and they navigated the road by its swinging yellow light, the horses steady, the valley quiet around them. You're good at this, Colton said, about an hour from home. My father? Not your father, he said. You. She looked at the dark road ahead. I haven't had much use for it in a while, she said finally. You do now, he said, and left it there, without adding anything, without turning it into something larger than it was. She sat with that for the rest of the ride home, and she didn't know what to call the feeling it produced in her. Not happiness, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that felt like a window opening in a room that had been shut up for too long. The ranch came into view around a bend in the road, the barn light, the house light, Pete's silhouette moving across the yard, the cattle invisible in the dark but present, breathing, the whole warm, complicated weight of a living place. Adelaide looked at it and thought, unexpectedly, there's work here that matters. She held on to that thought carefully, the way you hold anything fragile, aware of its weight, aware of how easily things break, but holding on nonetheless. The copies of those 6 documents lived in Adelaide's carpet bag for 3 days before she found a better place for them. A tin document box she'd discovered at the bottom of Colton's supply trunk, meant for deed storage, with a latch that actually worked. She lined it with oilcloth from a remnant she found in the barn and put it under her bed. Then she thought about that for a moment, about how automatically she had taken charge of the safekeeping without being asked, and she waited for the feeling of overstepping to arrive. It didn't. She wasn't sure what to do with that either. November settled over the valley with the particular purposefulness of a Montana winter that is still deciding how serious it wants to be. The mornings were hard with frost, the afternoons sometimes almost warm, the evenings dropping fast once the sun cleared the western ridge. Adelaide learned to layer, something she had never needed to consider in Philadelphia, where the cold was damp and pervasive rather than the sharp, dry, crystalline thing that bit at the edges of exposed skin and then retreated with a dignity that almost seemed intentional. She was healing. She could feel it the way you feel things getting better. Not in sudden improvements, but in small, incremental absences of pain, the gradual return of movements she had stopped attempting. By the 3rd week of November, she could carry the water bucket from the pump to the kitchen without stopping halfway. By the 4th, she could lift the cast iron skillet with her right arm without the deep pull along her rib cage that had been making her jaw tighten every morning since Philadelphia. She did not tell Colton any of this directly, but she noticed that he noticed, that when she lifted something heavier than she'd attempted before, he didn't jump to take it from her. He just watched the outcome and when it was fine, went back to whatever he was doing. She appreciated that more than she could easily explain. Most people, when they knew you were injured, either forgot entirely or became a kind of permanent concerned audience. Colton managed the precise middle thing, the attentiveness without the performance of attentiveness, and it cost her something to admit, even to herself, that she had started to rely on it. Pete Halverson's wife came by on a Thursday afternoon near the end of November. Her name was Bess, and she was 20 years old and enormously pregnant and entirely unbothered by both of these facts. She arrived in a wagon driven by her younger brother, carrying a covered dish of some kind and the cheerful aggression of someone who has decided to be your friend regardless of your feelings on the subject. "I've been meaning to come since you arrived," Bess said, handing Adelaide the dish, a deep dish apple cake, it turned out, and stepping into the kitchen with the assurance of someone who had been in this kitchen before. "Pete kept saying I should wait until you were settled. I told him you'd been settled for 3 weeks, and that was long enough." "It's fine," Adelaide said, and found that she meant it more than she expected to. "Please, sit down." Bess sat, both hands pressed to the sides of her belly in the automatic gesture of late pregnancy, and looked around the kitchen with frank interest. "You've moved things around. I hope that's not—" "No, it's good. The shelves were always backwards. Pete said so, but Colton's had it this way for 10 years, so nobody said anything." She turned her direct gaze on Adelaide. "How are you settling? Truthfully, not the polite version." Adelaide paused in the act of cutting the cake. It was such a specific distinction to make, truthfully, not the polite version, that it briefly disarmed her. "Better than I expected," she said, which was true. "The work is manageable. The cold is different than I'm used to." "It gets worse," Bess said cheerfully. "January is something else. You'll need better boots." She tilted her head. "Are you happy?" "Bess. I know. Too direct. Pete says I have no filter." She didn't look particularly troubled by this assessment. Colton's a good man, and he's been alone a long time, and I wanted to make sure you could see that." Adelaide set the cut cake on 2 plates and brought them to the table and sat down across from Bess. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like distant water. "He's been generous," Adelaide said carefully. Bess looked at her with the particular patience of someone very young who has somehow already learned when not to push. "That's a start," she said, and picked up her fork. They talked for 2 hours. Bess knew everyone in the county, their histories, their grudges, their better qualities, the complicated genealogies of who was related to whom and how the Halverson family had ended up in Montana from Minnesota 30 years ago. She talked the way some people breathe, continuously and without apparent effort, and Adelaide found herself doing something she had not done in a very long time, following a conversation without monitoring it for danger, just listening, just talking back. At some point, Bess said, "You know about the crow business?" Adelaide kept her expression neutral. "Some. Everybody knows Crow's been circling this land for 2 years. He wants the south pasture because there's water access on it. The creek runs through there, good flow even in dry years. If he gets that 40 acres, he controls the water for 3 other properties in the valley." Bess set her fork down. "He already pushed the Kendrick family off their place last year. Said there was a lien. There wasn't any lien. Everybody knew it. But the Kendricks didn't have money for lawyers, and they couldn't fight it." "Colton didn't tell me that part," Adelaide said. "Colton doesn't tell people things. He carries them himself and then acts surprised when his back hurts." Bess said it without malice, just as a fact. "But you're not people. You're his wife." She paused. "Sort of." "Sort of?" Adelaide agreed. Bess left before the light failed, her brother loading her back into the wagon with the exaggerated care of someone who had been told not to let her overdo it, and was doing his best. She waved from the wagon seat like she had known Adelaide for years, and Adelaide stood in the doorway and watched the wagon go, and felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately have a word for. Not loneliness. She had felt loneliness often enough to know its particular texture. This was more like the memory of not being lonely, a reminder that she had been capable of it once, and might be again. But she asked Colton about the Kendrick family that evening, after Pete had gone home and the kitchen had settled into its nighttime quiet. Colton was at the table with his ledger. Adelaide was washing the last of the dishes, her back to him, which made the question easier. "Bess mentioned them," she said. "The family Crow pushed off their property last year." A pause. The scratch of the pen stopped. "The Kendricks?" "Yes." Another pause. "Tom Kendrick and his mother. They're in Harlan now, renting rooms above the hardware store. Tom does day labor." His voice was flat in the particular way it got when he was describing something that made him angry, but that he didn't see the use of performing anger about. "The lien Crow filed was manufactured. I couldn't prove it at the time, didn't have the right documents." Adelaide dried her hands on the kitchen towel and turned around. Colton was looking at his ledger, but not writing in it. "He's done this before," she said, "to more than the Kendricks." "I suspect so. Crow's been county surveyor for 8 years. That's 8 years of access to property records, survey requests, deed filings. He set the pen down. A man in that position, if he's crooked, has 100 ways to make things difficult for people who can't afford to fight back. Adelaide sat down across from him. The lamp was between them, its light making the shadows move on the walls. "The documents from the county records," she said, "the ones I copied." "Yes. They don't just prove your boundary. They establish a pattern of what the correct methodology looks like. How the creek was historically referenced as a boundary marker for this entire section of the valley. If Crow used the post-flood creek bed as a reference point for your property, he likely did the same thing to the Kendricks, and possibly others." She leaned forward slightly. "If I could look at the Kendrick property records, their original deed, the survey Crow submitted, I might be able to find the same flaw." Colton was quiet for a moment. "The Kendricks already lost the property. A fraudulent lien can be challenged even after the fact, if the evidence is strong enough. It's harder, but it's not impossible." She paused. "My father did it twice." He looked at her. In the lamplight, his eyes were darker than their usual gray-brown, and there was something in his expression that she was beginning to recognize. The particular attentiveness that meant he was listening to her as someone whose opinion had weight, not as someone he was humoring or managing. "This would take a significant amount of your time," he said. "I'm aware. You didn't agree to come here to do legal work." "No," she said, "but I'm doing it. If I'm willing to do it, I think the conversation about whether I should is probably already settled." The corner of his mouth shifted. It was not quite a smile. He was sparing with those, but it was something adjacent, something that reached his eyes. "Tom Kendrick comes by sometimes to do fence work," Colton said. "I can ask him to bring whatever documents they still have." "Good," Adelaide said. "I'll need a few days with them. You'll have whatever time you need." He picked up his pen and looked back at the ledger and then looked up once more. "Adelaide." She waited. "Thank you," he said. Just that. She nodded and pushed back from the table and went to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a while, not quite ready to sleep, listening to the wind work along the north side of the barn and thinking about what it meant, what it actually meant, to be useful somewhere you had chosen to be. Tom Kendrick came on a Saturday, a quiet man in his late 30s with his mother's stubbornness visible in the set of his jaw and a wariness in his eyes that Adelaide recognized the way you recognize your own reflection in unexpected places. He brought a battered envelope of papers. His mother had kept them, he said, even when everyone told her there was no point. Adelaide spread them on the kitchen table while Colton and Tom talked outside about the fence sections. She went through the Kendrick documents the same way she had gone through Colton's, methodically, moving from oldest to most recent, building the picture piece by piece. The Crow survey on the Kendrick property was dated 1877. The original Kendrick deed was from 1861. And there, in the legal description of the northern boundary, was Harlan Creek, referenced by a specific distance from the same rock formation that appeared in Colton's documents. The same fixed point, the same historical creek bed. And Crow's 1877 survey had used the post-flood creek bed, had moved the Kendrick northern boundary south by 160 yards, shrinking their grazing land precisely enough to make the property marginal, unprofitable, not worth fighting for if you were a family without resources. She sat back. Then she took out a fresh piece of paper and started to write. She was still writing when Colton came back inside. He looked at the papers, at her bent head, at the organized stacks she had built across the table. He did not ask if she needed anything. He put the coffee on and set a cup near her elbow when it was ready, and went to the other side of the kitchen to work on the saddle strap he had been repairing for a week. They stayed like that for 2 hours. It was the most companionable Adelaide had felt in a room with another person since her father died. Crow used the same reference point error, she said eventually, without looking up. The rock formation. Same fixed point, different creek bed. He shifted the Kendrick northern boundary by 160 yards. That's what made the property unworkable. She set her pen down. This isn't incompetence. A surveyor makes one error like this, maybe. He made the same error on 2 adjacent properties in a way that benefited the same outcome. That's a pattern. Colton had set the saddle strap down. He was watching her. If I write this up clearly enough, she said, document the pattern, Show how both surveys deviate from the same historical reference baseline. It won't just challenge your boundary claim. It builds a case for official misconduct. That's a different order of problem for Crow. A boundary dispute is a civil matter. Official misconduct by a county surveyor is a criminal one. Helena, Colton said. The Territorial Land Commissioner's office. Yes, and possibly the Territorial Attorney General, depending on how the misconduct statute reads. She rubbed her eyes. She had been at this for 2 hours, and her handwriting had started to slope. I need to find a copy of the Territorial Survey Regulations, the ones that govern a county surveyor's methodological obligations. There might be something at the county law library in Harlan, Colton said. Small collection, but something. We should go Monday. We should. He was quiet a moment. Tom Kendrick, if this works, if the Kendrick survey is found fraudulent, does he get the property back? That depends on what Crow did with the lien proceeds and what the current title situation looks like. It's more complicated than the boundary dispute, but it's possible. She paused. It's worth trying. Colton looked at the table full of papers. Her handwriting, her organizing logic, her father's methodology translated into her particular precision, and he said something that Adelaide did not expect. When my wife was alive, he said, she used to say that the thing she was worst at was asking for help, that it took more courage to ask for help than to manage alone. He looked up. I didn't really believe that until recently. Adelaide looked at him carefully. You didn't ask for help. I offered. I know, he said. That's the part I keep thinking about. He picked up the saddle strap again and went back to work. And Adelaide looked down at her papers, and the wind outside moved through the grass the way it always did. Insistent, unhurried, going where it was going regardless of anyone's plans. And she thought about courage, about what form it took when nobody was watching, about whether it was still courage, when it didn't feel like anything dramatic, but just felt like sitting at a table and doing the thing you knew how to do. She thought it probably was. She picked up her pen. The trip to the Harlan Law Library on Monday produced 3 relevant volumes of territorial statutes and a conversation with the county clerk. A different clerk than Emmett, a thin-faced woman named Mrs. Garfield, who turned out to know considerably more about the territory's land records than her title suggested. She was careful about what she said and how she said it, but she mentioned, almost in passing, that the Territorial Land Commissioner's office had received 2 prior complaints about Harlan County survey methodology, and that both had been, in her words, resolved at the local level before they could go anywhere. Adelaide thanked her and did not ask what resolved at the local level meant. She already knew. On the ride home, she told Colton what Mrs. Garfield had said. 2 prior complaints, he repeated. That never made it to Helena, which means Crow has a way of suppressing them here before they can escalate. She watched the road ahead. When we file our challenge, we bypass the county office entirely. We go straight to Helena by post, and we send a copy by separate post the same day, so that if one is intercepted, the other still arrives. Colton glanced at her. Intercepted? I'm being careful, not dramatic, she said. A man who has suppressed 2 prior complaints knows how to apply pressure on the local mail system. It's not complicated. It's just small county corruption. You're not what I expected, Colton said. She looked at him. He was watching the road, his profile easy and weathered in the gray November light. What did you expect? She asked. He thought about it honestly, the way he did most things. Someone more careful about taking up space. She almost laughed. She caught it, but barely. I was careful, she said, for a long time. I got tired of it. I'm glad, he said simply. They rode the rest of the way in the quiet that had become, without Adelaide entirely noticing when it happened, the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need filling, that 2 people can sit inside without either of them feeling the pressure to perform. The ranch appeared in the early dark, lit from within, Pete's lantern moving across the yard. The cattle were settled somewhere in the far pasture. The frost was already reforming on the fence posts. Adelaide climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. She could do that now, without pain, and she carried her carpet bag inside, and she set it on the table, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on the tin document box under the table's edge, feeling the solid weight of what was inside it. 2 properties, 2 surveys, 1 pattern, and a woman who had come to Montana to disappear into a quiet life and instead found herself building something she hadn't planned on building. A case, yes, but also something else. Something she was not quite ready to name and wasn't sure she needed to name yet. She was not safe yet. She knew better than to think otherwise. The ribs were almost healed, but the other things, the things that lived deeper than bone, those took longer. And there were things she had not told Colton. Things that were still following her west, slow and inevitable as a season turning. But tonight the kitchen was warm. The work was real. And for the first time in months, she did not feel like she was waiting for the floor to give way. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days after they had posted their challenge to Helena by 2 separate routes. Adelaide knew it was not from the Territorial Land Commissioner's office before she even read the return address, because the Territorial office would have sent something official, a form letter, a docketing notice, something stamped and bureaucratic. This envelope was plain, the handwriting on the front precise and controlled in a way she recognized the way you recognize a voice you hoped never to hear again. She was alone in the kitchen when Pete brought it in from the postwriter. He set it on the table and went back out without asking about it, because Pete had the instinct, rare and valuable in a man that young, to know when not to linger. Adelaide stood at the table and looked at the envelope for a long moment without touching it. The return address said Victor Mercer, Esquire, Mercer and Holloway, attorneys at law, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her brother-in-law had found her. She had known, in the abstract, that he would eventually. Victor Mercer was not a man who let things go. He was a man who kept records and nursed grievances and believed that the world owed him a particular arrangement of facts, and when the facts didn't cooperate, he adjusted them until they did. She had watched him do it to other people for the 6 years of her marriage to Gerald. She had spent the past 7 months understanding, with increasing clarity, that she had become one of those people. She sat down and opened the letter. It was short. Victor's letters were always short when he was being threatening. He had learned, somewhere in his legal training, that brevity read as confidence, that a man who didn't need to explain himself was a man who held the stronger position. 3 paragraphs. The first established that he was aware of her current location and circumstances. The second suggested, in language that stopped just short of explicit, that the narrative surrounding Gerald's death remained unresolved and that her departure from Philadelphia had done nothing to help her position in that regard. The third said that he intended to visit Montana in the new year to discuss the matter personally, and that he trusted she would conduct herself with the dignity appropriate to a woman who had benefited from the Mercer family's generosity. Adelaide read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases, put it back in the envelope, and sat with her hands flat on the table and breathed through the particular cold feeling that had settled in her sternum. Not panic, not quite, but its immediate neighbor, the thing that lived just before panic arrived. She had known this was coming. She had known it since Philadelphia, since the night she packed her trunk in the dark. She had been hoping the distance would buy her more time. It had bought her 2 months, which was not nothing, but was also not enough. She was still sitting there when Colton came in for the midday meal. He took one look at her and stopped inside the doorway. "What happened?" he said. She pushed the envelope across the table toward him. "My brother-in-law knows where I am. He's coming in the new year." Colton crossed to the table, picked up the envelope, read the letter. He read it the way he did most things, without visible reaction, his face still, his eyes moving steadily through the words. Then he set it down and pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "Tell me," he said, and she understood that he meant all of it, not just Victor's letter, not just the land dispute, not just the careful surface of the life she had assembled here. He meant the thing underneath, the thing she had been carrying since before she boarded the train in Philadelphia, the thing that had made her hold herself rigid on that platform in Harlan in October, the thing that woke her some nights with her heart going fast and the dark pressing in around the edges of the room. She had planned, in some distant, theoretical way, to tell him eventually. She had imagined it happening gradually, pieces of it emerging over months, the whole shape of it only becoming visible slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. She had not planned for it to happen like this, across a kitchen table at noon with the winter light coming flat and gray through the north window, and her hand still cold from the shock of Victor's handwriting. But she looked at Colton Reeves sitting across from her, patient, not performing patience, but actually inhabiting it. And she thought about what Bess had said. Colton doesn't tell people things. He carries them himself. And she thought about how she had watched him carry things. The Crow dispute, the memory of Sarah, the weight of a ranch run alone for 4 years. Without complaint and without theater, and how she had found that quality admirable, and also she now recognized familiar, because she did the same thing, had been doing it her whole adult life, and she was beginning to wonder if carrying things alone was actually a form of courage or just a very sophisticated way of not trusting anyone. "Gerald," she said, "my husband, he was not a good man." She said it plainly, without drama, the way you state a fact that is simply true. And then she kept going. She told him about the first year of the marriage, the way Gerald had been charming in public, and then quietly, methodically different in private. Not violent at first, just controlling. The way he managed her movements, her correspondence, her friendships, until she existed inside a very small world whose boundaries she hadn't noticed closing in until she was already inside them. She told him about the arguments that started in the 3rd year, when she had begun to push back, when she had understood what she was inside and had started to resist it, clumsily at first, and then with more direction as her father's training surfaced in her in ways Gerald had not anticipated. That Adelaide could read a legal document, could identify a fraudulent claim, could argue a position with precision. These things had disturbed Gerald in a way she had not expected. He had married a woman he believed he understood, and then discovered she was more complicated than his understanding, and he had not responded to that discovery with curiosity. She told him about the staircase. She told it without flinching. The argument, the way Gerald had grabbed her arm, the moment when her footing went and she was falling and she knew with a horrible clarity that she had not tripped. The bottom of the staircase, the 3 ribs, the concussion that the Mercer family physician had recorded in his notes as a domestic accident without meeting her eyes. Gerald had died 11 days later. His heart, which had been weak for years according to his private physician, a fact his family had known and Adelaide had not, had simply stopped during the night. He was found in his study in the morning. Adelaide had been asleep in the room where they'd moved her while her ribs were healing. Victor decided almost immediately, she said, that Gerald's death was connected to what happened on the stairs. There's no evidence of that. None. Gerald's physician confirmed the heart condition in writing, but Victor is a lawyer, and he knows how to suggest things without proving them, and the Mercer family has money and connections in Philadelphia, and I had neither, and I had just left my husband's house in the night, which looked like... She stopped, started again. It looked like flight, even though I was running from them, not from anything I'd done. Colton had not moved during any of this. His hands were on the table, still. His eyes were on her face. "The 3 ribs," he said quietly. "That's how you arrived here. They were 2 months healed by then, but yes. He pushed you down the stairs. Yes." The words sat between them. Outside, a gust moved along the barn roof, a long, low sound like something settling. "Victor knows about Crow," Adelaide said. "That's what the letter means. He knows I'm here, he knows who I married, and if Crow is connected to anyone in Philadelphia, anyone in the legal or business networks that the Mercer family moves in, then Victor will use Crow's situation against me. He'll try to make me look like a woman who causes legal trouble wherever she goes. Unstable, litigious, someone whose word can't be trusted. And if your word can't be trusted," Colton said slowly, working it through, "then the survey challenge falls apart. The survey challenge is based substantially on my analysis, my reading of the documents. If Victor can undermine my credibility before the territorial commissioner evaluates our filing..." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "Yes, it falls apart." Colton was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen clock ticked. The stove made its small settling sounds. "Does Crow know Victor Mercer?" he asked. "I don't know. But Victor knows people everywhere. He has legal connections in a dozen states and territories. He makes it his business to know people." She looked at the letter on the table. "It may be coincidence that this arrived when it did, that Victor simply tracked me down through Mrs. Dunning's placement service and the timing is unrelated to Crow. Or it may not be." "It may not be," Colton agreed. His voice had gone quieter, more deliberate. She recognized that quality by now. It was not coldness, but concentration. The same thing that happened in his face when he was working through a difficult problem with the cattle or the property accounts. He was thinking, "What do you want to do?" he asked. The question surprised her, though she was not sure why it still did. He kept asking her that, kept treating her choices as hers to make. And she kept being caught off guard by it, which said something about how thoroughly she had stopped expecting it. "I don't want to run again," she said. It came out more raw than she intended. "Then we don't run," he said. Simple, final. She looked at him. "You don't know the full weight of the Mercer family, Colton. Victor he doesn't let things go. He has resources, and he has patience, and he will come here and he will try to destroy everything I've built." "I heard you," Colton said. "We don't run." She felt something break open in her chest. Not painfully, but with the specific pressure of something that has been held under compression for a very long time finally being released. She pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment, not crying, just holding herself together while something reorganized. "I need to write all of it down," she said when she could. What happened with Gerald? The physician's documentation, the staircase, the timeline of his death. Everything that Victor might use, I need to have my own version documented, clearly, factually, with dates and names and the records I can support it with. She lowered her hands. "And I need to write to Dr. Harmon in Philadelphia. My father's physician. He knew Gerald's doctor. They had a professional relationship. He may be able to obtain a copy of Gerald's cardiac records. If I have those in hand before Victor arrives, I can demonstrate that Gerald's death was documented as cardiac in origin by his own physician before anyone ever suggested otherwise." Colton nodded. "Write it tonight. I'll get it posted first thing tomorrow." "Colton." She made herself hold his gaze. "If this comes out fully, if it becomes known here what happened in Philadelphia, what Victor is claiming, it could affect you, your reputation, the case we're building against Crow, a rancher whose wife is under suspicion of Adelaide." His voice was not sharp, but it was firm. "I'm not interested in a reputation built on leaving someone to face that alone." She did not know what to say to that. She sat with it for a moment, turning it over, looking for the angle, the condition buried inside the generosity. She found nothing, just the statement, sitting there without any apparent mechanism for control or manipulation, offered the way he offered most things, directly and without theater. "All right," she said finally. "Good." He stood up, moved to the stove, poured 2 cups of coffee, and set one in front of her. "Eat something first." "You look like you haven't since breakfast." She almost laughed. It came out as a sound that was half laugh and half something raw, and she covered it by picking up the coffee cup, and he went to get bread from the shelf without making anything of it, which was exactly right. She wrote for 4 hours that evening, the full account of her marriage to Gerald Mercer, organized chronologically and documented with every supporting detail she could provide from memory. The name of Gerald's physician, Dr. Clement Walsh. The dates of the incidents she could remember precisely. The names of the Mercer family solicitors. The full name and title of the physician who had treated her broken ribs. A Dr. Nathaniel Park, who had attended her at the Mercer house and whose notes would exist in the family's medical records. The date of Gerald's death. The date she had left Philadelphia. She wrote the account of the staircase without softening it, because softening it would only make Victor's version easier to layer over the top. Facts were facts. The staircase had happened. Her ribs had been documented. Gerald's heart condition had been documented by his own physician before his death. These things were all true, and the truth, arranged clearly and supported by evidence, was the only structure she had ever seen hold up under sustained attack. Her father had taught her that. The argument that wins isn't always the loudest one, Addie. It's the one that's still standing when everything else has been knocked over. Colton sat across the kitchen for part of that evening, working his way through the Territorial Survey statute book she had brought back from Harlan. He read the way he did most things, methodically, without rushing, occasionally pausing to ask her a question about legal terminology. And she answered without looking up from her own writing, and they worked in that parallel quiet that had become, without either of them declaring it, simply how they spent their evenings. At some point around 9 o'clock, he said, "There's a provision here, in the territorial statutes. A county surveyor who has been found to have submitted a fraudulent survey can be held personally liable for damages sustained by property owners as a result." Adelaide's pen slowed. "That's a civil liability provision." "Yes. But it also triggers automatic review of all surveys submitted by that surveyor in the prior 5 years. He looked up. "That's not just your property and the Kendricks. That's every survey Crow has done in 8 years, theoretically, if the review finds sufficient cause. Adelaide set her pen down. If the territorial commissioner opens a review of all Crow's surveys, she said slowly, then Crow's position in Harlan County is finished regardless of what happens in court. Nobody is going to continue using a surveyor under territorial investigation. And without his position, Colton said, his ability to manipulate local land records disappears. They looked at each other across the table. The lamp was burning low, the kitchen settling into its nighttime sounds around them. We need to include the liability provision reference in the filing, Adelaide said. Specifically cite it, not as an accusation, as a note that the filer is aware of its existence. She picked up her pen again. It signals to the commissioner that we know the full scope of what this could become, that we're not just two ranchers disputing a boundary line, we know the law. You know the law, Colton said. We, she said, and meant it. Something shifted in his expression, brief and real, and not performed. The kind of thing that comes and goes too quickly to be theater. She turned back to her writing. He turned back to the statute book. Outside, the December wind moved through the valley with a sound like the whole country breathing, and the frost built itself quietly along the fence posts and the window glass. And inside the kitchen, two people worked side by side on something that mattered, and neither of them said anything more about it, because some things don't need to be said to be understood. The letter to Dr. Harmon went out with the Morning Post. The revised filing, expanded now to include the liability provision reference and a carefully worded paragraph noting the pattern of survey methodology errors across multiple Harlan County properties, went out 3 days later by 2 separate posts, as before. And then they waited. Waiting was harder than working. Adelaide had always known this about herself, that stillness was its own kind of difficulty, that she did better when there was a task in front of her. She filled the waiting days with the practical work of the ranch, which was considerable. The winter feeding schedule was more demanding than the autumn routine, requiring twice daily checks on the cattle, the constant management of feed and water in freezing temperatures, the maintenance of equipment that the cold worked against in 100 small ways. She worked alongside Pete more now, outside in the frost-stiff mornings, learning the rhythm of the cattle operation in the direct way. Not from reading about it, but from doing it, making mistakes, being corrected without condescension, doing it again. Her ribs were fully healed by mid-December, and she discovered that she liked the physical work in a way she hadn't expected, the kind of tiredness that came from her body being genuinely used rather than from the sustained low-level tension of being always on guard. She was not always on guard here. She noticed this gradually, the same way she had noticed the pain decreasing, through absences rather than presences. She would realize, partway through a morning's work, that she had not been monitoring the room she was in, that she had not been tracking the nearest exit, that she had spent an hour simply doing a thing without calculating what it meant or who was watching or what might be required of her next. It was an odd feeling, disconcerting in its own way, like a sound you've gotten so accustomed to that you only notice it was there when it stops. Bess came by twice more in December, the second time only a week before her baby was due, enormous and cheerful and full of opinions about everything. She brought Adelaide into the small community of women in the valley the way she did everything, with cheerful aggression and no patience for shyness. There was a women's work gathering at the Halverson place the second week of December, and Bess informed Adelaide she was coming, not asked, and Adelaide went and sat in a warm kitchen with 6 other women she did not know, and by the end of the afternoon knew the broad outlines of all their lives and had shared, carefully, some of her own. Nobody asked about Philadelphia. Nobody asked about Gerald. But several of them, in various ways, indicated that they had heard she had found something wrong with Crow's survey of the Reeves property. And the tone in which they said this, quiet, significant, something hopeful underneath, told her what Crow meant to this community and what it would mean if he could be stopped. On the way home, driving the wagon alone in the early dark because Colton had been needed on the south pasture that day, Adelaide thought about her father's practice in Philadelphia, about the clients who had come to him with land disputes and fraudulent liens, and the particular desperation of people who have worked for something and are about to lose it to someone more powerful who has decided they want it. She had grown up in the margins of those cases, listening from the hallway, reading the letters, watching her father build arguments out of documents and patience and the precise application of what the law actually said versus what powerful men wanted it to say. She had not planned to do this work here. She had come to Montana to disappear, to heal, to become someone smaller and quieter and less visible. And instead she had arrived and found a problem she knew how to solve. And she had solved it, was in the process of solving it, because it was there and she could, and because the people it was happening to were real, and the injustice was real, and she was done, apparently, with making herself small enough to fit inside other people's comfort. She was not sure exactly when that had happened. Somewhere between Philadelphia and here. Somewhere in the gap between who she had been made into and who she actually was. The ranch came into view around the last bend, the house lit from within, a lamp in the kitchen window making a yellow square of warmth in the dark. She could see Colton's horse in the corral. He had come back from the south pasture then. The smoke from the stove chimney went straight up in the cold, undisturbed by wind for once. She pulled the wagon up to the barn and climbed down and began unhitching the horses with the practiced efficiency she had developed over the past 2 months. And she was almost finished when she heard boots on the frozen ground behind her, and Colton appeared from the barn door with a lantern. "How was it?" he asked, taking the bridle without asking, leading the near horse inside. "Good," she said, and followed with the other horse. "I think I understand this valley a little better now." He hung the lantern and began working on the horses with the same economy of movement she had come to know. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate, nothing wasted. "Crow was in town today," he said. Pete heard. He was at the land office. Adelaide paused. "Doing what?" "Nobody knows exactly, but he was there for 2 hours, and he came out looking—" Colton paused, searching for the word. "Unsettled." Pete said the clerk looked unsettled too. Adelaide finished her side of the horse and moved to help with the second. They worked around each other in the small space with the ease of two people who have learned each other's movements. "The filing reached Helena," she said. "It must have. If someone there contacted the county land office for preliminary information, that would explain it. Crow knows something is in motion." She straightened up. "Which means whatever he's going to do about it, he'll do it soon, before the commissioner can act." Colton looked at her over the horse's back. The lantern light was between them, and his face was serious and steady and entirely unafraid. "Then we make sure we're ready," he said. "We've done everything we can do from here," she said. "The filing is in. The documents are on record. The pattern is documented." She met his eyes. "Now we wait for Victor to arrive, and we handle that, and we see what the commissioner's office does." A pause. "We've built the best case we can. Either it holds or it doesn't." "It holds," Colton said, with a certainty that was not reckless, but was not uncertain either. The specific confidence of a man who knows what he built and knows he built it well. Adelaide looked at him for a moment. The cold outside was pressing at the barn walls. The horses shifted and settled. "Colton," she said, "when Victor comes, and he will come, I need you to know something. Whatever he says about me, whatever version of events he brings with him—" "Adelaide, let me finish. Whatever he says, I need you to know that I told you the truth. Tonight. All of it. There isn't another version hiding underneath." He was quiet for a moment. The lantern flame moved slightly, though she couldn't feel a draft. "I know that," he said. "You can't know that. You've known me 2 months." "I know it," he said again simply, and turned back to the horse. She stood there in the barn in the cold lantern light, and she felt the truth of what she had told him, all of it, no other version underneath, settle into the room around them, and she thought that this was what honesty felt like when it was received without flinching. Not comfortable exactly, but solid, like ground that would hold. She picked up her side of the work and finished it without saying anything more, because there was nothing more to say. The night was cold and the barn was warm, and Victor Mercer was coming from Philadelphia, and she was not going to run. Bess Halverson's baby arrived on the 19th of December. A boy, 7 pounds and loud about it, born in the Halverson house with the midwife from Harlan and Adelaide present, because Bess had asked her specifically, and Adelaide had not known how to say no, and then, once she was there, had not wanted to. It was a long night and a difficult one. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, when things got hard enough that even Bess stopped talking, Adelaide held her hand and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, and Bess didn't need words. She needed someone who wasn't going to leave the room. The boy was healthy. Bess named him Caleb. Pete stood in the doorway of the bedroom afterward with an expression that had no adequate description, something between terror and wonder. All the usual competence gone out of his face, replaced by something raw and new. Adelaide drove herself home in the pre-dawn dark, the wagon creaking on the frozen road, the stars still out over the mountains. She was tired in a way that went past the body into something deeper, and she sat on the wagon seat with the reins loose in her hands and let the horses find their own way. And she thought about Bess's hand gripping hers in the hard hours, and about Pete's face in the doorway, and about the particular weight of being present for something real, something that mattered entirely and immediately, with no room for performance or strategy or the careful management of other people's perceptions. She had not had that in a long time, being present for something that asked nothing from her except to be there. The ranch was quiet when she arrived. She put the horses up and went inside and found Colton at the kitchen table with the stove burning and coffee made, which meant he had heard the wagon and gotten up, which meant he had probably been awake already. He looked at her face when she came in and handed her the coffee without a word. "Boy," she said, sitting down. "Both doing well." He nodded. "Pete must be something to see right now." "He looked like the ground had moved under him," she said, "in the best possible way." Colton almost smiled. "Yeah, that sounds right." He looked at her for a moment. "You should sleep. In a minute." She wrapped both hands around the cup. The kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee, and the particular cedar smoke smell of the stove burning birch, and she sat with that for a moment before she said, "The reply from Dr. Harmon came yesterday while I was at Bess's." Colton was still. "I know," she said. "I should have told you last night before I left. I didn't have time to read it properly." She reached into her coat pocket and set the letter on the table. "I read it on the way home." He waited. "Harmon got the cardiac records," she said. "Gerald's physician, Dr. Walsh, documented the heart condition in his private files as early as 1874, 3 years before Gerald died. He noted it as a progressive condition, likely fatal within 5 to 10 years. He had recommended Gerald reduce his professional activities and stress. Gerald refused and told Walsh to keep it out of any records that the family might see." She paused. "Walsh died last spring, but Harmon knew his attending nurse. She kept her own notes, nurses often do, and she remembered the Mercer case because Walsh had spoken to her about the ethical difficulty of keeping a terminal diagnosis private at a patient's explicit request." "The nurse's notes," Colton said. "Harmon included a sworn statement from her, name, dates, what Walsh told her." Adelaide smoothed the letter on the table. "It's not Walsh's direct records. Those may be gone or held by the Mercer family's solicitors, which amounts to the same thing. But a nurse's sworn statement about what the attending physician told her is admissible testimony in most jurisdictions. It establishes that Gerald's heart condition was documented and known before his death, independent of anything that happened on that staircase." Colton looked at the letter. "Victor Mercer doesn't know about the nurse. He can't. Walsh is dead and the Mercers would have no reason to know who Walsh spoke to privately." She folded the letter back along its creases. "Victor is coming here expecting a frightened widow with nothing but her own word against his family's version of events. He's not expecting documentation." "When is he coming?" "His letter said New Year. That means January, probably. The trains don't run well into Montana in deep winter, so he'll wait for a break in the weather." She looked out the kitchen window at the dark. "We have 2, maybe 3 weeks." "Then we use them," Colton said. The response from the Territorial Land Commissioner's office arrived 4 days before Christmas, and it was not what Adelaide had expected, which was to say it was better. The commissioner, a man named Aldous Pratt, whose signature was large and whose letter was unusually direct for a government document, had received their filing and the supporting documentation, had reviewed the survey records she had copied, and had found sufficient basis to open a formal review of the Harlan County boundary survey in question. He had also, and this was the part Adelaide read twice, flagged the liability provision reference in their filing and noted that the pattern documentation she had included regarding the Kendrick property would be examined as part of the review's scope. The review would be conducted by a territorial surveyor from Helena, independent of any county authority. Elias Crow would be formally notified and would have 30 days to respond to the preliminary findings. Adelaide sat with the letter for a long time. It was not a victory. It was the beginning of a process that could still go wrong in a dozen ways. But it was official, and it was documented, and it meant that whatever Crow did next, he was doing it under the eye of the territorial office rather than in the quiet dark of local authority where he had operated comfortably for 8 years. She brought the letter to Colton in the barn. He read it standing up, one hand still on the fence post he'd been working with, and when he finished, he looked at her with something that was quieter than relief, but more durable. "Tom Kendrick should know about this," he said. "I was going to say the same thing." Tom came that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and his face careful in the way of someone who has been disappointed enough times to hold hope at a distance until it proves itself. Adelaide walked him through the letter plainly, without embellishment, explaining what the review meant and what it didn't yet mean, what the liability provision could potentially produce for the Kendrick property, and what the realistic timeline looked like. When she finished, Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother kept those papers for a year. Everybody told her there wasn't any point." "Your mother was right," Adelaide said. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the same thing she had felt in the Harlan Records office when the creek boundary came clear in the documents. The specific sensation of a thing that has been wrong for a long time beginning to move toward being right. "Thank you," he said. He said it to both of them, but he was looking at Adelaide. She nodded and refilled his coffee and didn't make more of it than it was, because her father had taught her that too. That the work was the point, not the gratitude. And that if you did it for the gratitude, you'd eventually stop doing it because people forgot to give it, and then you'd have nothing. Christmas came and went with less ceremony than Adelaide had expected and more warmth. Bess sent a pie over with Pete, who was still wearing the expression of a man whose ground had permanently shifted but was beginning to find his footing on the new terrain. 2 neighboring families stopped by. The Adlers from the property north of the creek, the Bergman widow who ran a small operation 2 miles east, and sat in the kitchen for an hour each, drinking coffee, talking about the winter and the cattle prices and the review letter, which had somehow become general knowledge in the valley within a week of its arrival. Mrs. Bergman, who was 60-something and had been in Montana since before it was a territory, sat across from Adelaide and said, without preamble, "Crow pushed my son off a grazing lease 3 years ago, said there was an access dispute. There wasn't one. He manufactured it. My son didn't have money to fight it." She looked at her coffee cup. "If this review finds what I think it'll find, that won't be the only case that surfaces." "It may not," Adelaide said carefully. "The review's scope is currently limited to the properties I was able to document. Expanding it would require additional evidence." "I have the original lease documents," Mrs. Bergman said. "Been keeping them in a tin under my kitchen floor." She looked up at Adelaide directly. "My son thought I was being foolish." Adelaide held her gaze. "I'd like to see them, if you're willing." Something settled in the older woman's expression, something that had been held tight for a long time releasing by a small degree. "I'll bring them after the New Year," she said. After the guests were gone and the kitchen was quiet again, Colton stood washing the cups at the basin and Adelaide sat at the table with a fresh piece of paper, making notes. Mrs. Bergman's name, the approximate date of the lease dispute, what documentation might exist. She was 3 lines in when she realized what she was doing, building another case. Instinctively, without being asked. She set the pen down and looked at what she'd written. "You're thinking that this is bigger than we planned for," Colton said from the basin, without turning around. She had not told him what she was thinking, but he'd been in the same room. "Yes," she said. "Is that a problem?" She considered the question. "No," she said slowly. "But it means committing to something more than defending your property line. It means, if Bergman's documents support what she's saying, and if there are others, we're looking at a coordinated challenge to Crow's entire tenure as county surveyor. That's a different undertaking." Colton dried his hands and turned around. "And you can do that?" "I'm not a licensed attorney." "That's not what I asked." She looked at the paper in front of her, at her own handwriting, at the names and dates she had already instinctively organized into a structure. "Yes," she said. "I can do that." "Then that's what we do," he said, and sat down across from her. Victor Mercer arrived on the 14th of January. Adelaide knew he was coming 2 days before he appeared at the ranch, because Harlan was a small place, and a man like Victor, polished, Eastern, expensive coat, the particular bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in whatever room he entered, was noticed immediately and talked about within hours. Pete heard from the feed store owner, who heard from the hotel keeper, a man from Philadelphia, a lawyer, asking about the Reeves property. She told Colton that evening. "How do you want to handle it?" he asked. "Here," she said. "At the ranch. Not in town where he can control the setting." She paused. "He'll come to us. That's how Victor operates. He prefers to arrive uninvited because it's supposed to put you at a disadvantage, so we let him come. And we're ready." "What does ready look like?" "The document box. Everything organized and accessible. The commissioner's letter visible on the table. The nurse's statement from Harmon. My written account of the staircase and Gerald's death." She was thinking out loud, moving the pieces. "And Pete." "Pete. Victor won't be rude in front of a witness he can't assess. He doesn't know Pete. He doesn't know what Pete might repeat or to whom. Having a third person in the room limits his range of behavior." She looked at Colton. "He does his best work one-on-one, or on women he thinks are alone." Colton's jaw tightened very slightly. "Pete will be there." Victor arrived at 10:30 on a Thursday morning, in a hired wagon driven by a man from the Harlan livery who looked profoundly uncomfortable with the company. Victor stepped down from the wagon in a coat that cost more than most families in the valley earned in a month, surveyed the ranch with the expression of someone cataloging deficiencies, and walked to the door with the measured pace of a man who believed the ground arranged itself under his feet. Adelaide opened the door before he knocked. She had thought about this moment for months, had built it in her mind different ways, feared it different ways. The version she had imagined most often was herself frightened, underprepared, scrambling. She was not frightened. She was, she realized, standing in the doorway of a ranch she had spent 3 months learning and working and building something real inside of, and Victor Mercer was a man from a city she had left. And the distance between those two facts felt, at this moment, absolute. "Victor," she said. He looked at her. She watched him recalibrate. She could see it, the small adjustment behind his eyes, because she was not what he had anticipated. She was not pale or shaking or wearing the expression of a woman who has been found out. "Adelaide," he said, "you look well?" "Come in," she said. "It's cold." Colton was at the table when they entered. Sitting, not standing, which Adelaide had suggested because standing looked defensive and sitting looked settled. Pete was at the stove, nominally tending something, actually doing exactly what Adelaide had asked him to do, which was exist in the room. Victor took in the scene. His gaze moved over Colton, over Pete, over the table with the document box and the visible papers, and she watched him decide how to proceed. "Mr. Reeves," he said, offering his hand to Colton with the smooth condescension of a man who believes he is doing a social inferior a favor. Colton shook it briefly. "Mr. Mercer, sit down." Victor sat. Adelaide sat across from him. The document box was between them on the table, closed. "I'll be direct," Victor said, arranging himself in the chair with the particular ease of a man who has had this kind of conversation many times and won it. "I've come a considerable distance because I'm concerned about Adelaide's well-being. The circumstances under which she left Philadelphia were irregular, and the questions surrounding Gerald's death remain, in the minds of certain members of our family, unresolved." "What questions specifically?" Adelaide said. Victor looked at her with the patient tolerance of someone managing a difficult situation. "The nature of Gerald's injury—" "Gerald wasn't injured," Adelaide said. "Gerald died of a heart condition. His own physician documented it. Walsh's records may or may not be available. What is available is the sworn statement of his attending nurse, who recalls Walsh describing Gerald's cardiac diagnosis in 1874, 3 years before his death, as progressive and likely terminal." She opened the document box and removed the Harmon letter and the nurse's statement and placed them on the table in front of Victor. "You're welcome to read it." Something moved in Victor's expression. It was brief and quickly controlled, but she saw it. The adjustment, the plan he had arrived with colliding with a fact he had not anticipated. He picked up the nurse's statement and read it. His face was very still while he read. "A nurse's recollection," he began, "is sworn testimony," Adelaide said, "admissible in any court in the territory, or in Pennsylvania if you prefer that venue. She held his gaze. Victor, I know what you've been telling people in Philadelphia. I know the version of events you've been constructing. I'm telling you that I have documentation that contradicts every material claim in that version, and that I am prepared to present it formally if you choose to pursue this. You pushed him, Victor said. His voice dropped to something quieter and more dangerous, the register he used when he was done with performance and getting to the point. On that staircase. You pushed him. No, Adelaide said. He pushed me, and I have a physician's record of my injuries from that night. Dr. Nathaniel Park, who treated my fractured ribs in the Mercer house, whose notes are part of your family's own medical records. 3 broken ribs, Victor. Your family's physician documented them. In your family's house. The room was very quiet. Pete had stopped moving at the stove. Colton was watching Victor with the steady, unreadable attention of a man who has decided exactly how far he will let something go before he intervenes, and who is waiting to see if intervention becomes necessary. Victor set the nurse's statement down. He looked at Adelaide for a long moment with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the managed patience, not the legal authority, not the tolerant condescension. Something flatter. Something that meant he was recalculating. You've built yourself quite a position here, he said. I've built myself a life here, she said. That's different. The family has Gerald's memory, which I am not interested in damaging, and they have Gerald's estate, which I signed away entirely when I left Philadelphia, and I have no claim on either. She kept her voice even. What I have is documentation of what happened in that house, and a willingness to use it if you continue to follow me with accusations you cannot support. She paused. I don't want to fight with you, Victor. I want you to go home. He looked at Colton. Colton looked back at him without expression. Your wife, Victor said to him, with a small inflection on the word that was meant to raise a doubt, has a complicated history. My wife, Colton said, with no inflection at all, is the most capable person I've encountered in 36 years, and she's answered your questions. I think we're done. Victor sat for another moment. She could see him working through it, the cost-benefit of continuing versus the reality of what he had found here, which was not a frightened woman alone, but a woman with documentation and a witness and a husband who was not going to be leveraged or embarrassed or moved. He stood, picked up his hat. I hope Montana suits you, Adelaide, he said. The graciousness was entirely surface, the concession underneath it real. It does, she said. She and Colton walked him to the door. The hired wagon was still in the yard, the driver clearly having been waiting in the cold this whole time. And he looked up with visible relief when Victor appeared. Victor crossed the yard without looking back, climbed into the wagon, and was driven back toward Harlan. Adelaide stood in the doorway and watched the wagon until it went around the bend in the road. Then she let out a breath that she had probably been holding, in various ways, for 7 months. You all right? Colton asked from just behind her. Yes, she said, and then, he'll go home. He got what he came for. An assessment. He knows now that pursuing this costs more than it gains. She turned around. It's over. That part. Pete was still at the stove, studiously not looking at either of them, his ears clearly excellent. Pete, Colton said. Sir. Thank you for being here. Pete touched the brim of his hat and turned back to whatever he was pretending to cook. Adelaide looked at Colton and something moved between them. Not words, not yet, but something that had the shape of what words would eventually be, something that had been building since October with the patient, unhurried accumulation of days. The territorial surveyor arrived from Helena on the 22nd of January, a precise, methodical man named Fletcher, who wore spectacles and took notes in a hand so small it was nearly illegible, and who spent 4 days examining the South Pasture boundary, the rock formation reference point, the historical creek bed markers, and every document Adelaide had compiled. He said almost nothing evaluative during the inspection, but on the morning of his departure he stood in the kitchen with his coat on and his bag in his hand and said to Adelaide, "The pattern documentation you submitted was the strongest part of the filing. Most people don't think to look for patterns. They see one wrong thing and address one wrong thing. My father was a land attorney," she said. "He taught you well," Fletcher said, and left. 3 weeks later, the commissioner's preliminary ruling arrived. The Harlan County Boundary Survey submitted by Elias Crow regarding the Reeves South Pasture was found to be methodologically deficient and legally insufficient to support the claimed boundary adjustment. The survey was invalidated. The boundary was confirmed at its historical location. The 40 acres remained part of the Reeves property, as it always had been, and the Territorial Land Commissioner was opening a formal investigation into all surveys conducted by Elias Crow during his tenure as Harlan County Surveyor, effective immediately, pending the findings of the preliminary review. Adelaide read the ruling at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in February, with the winter light coming pale through the north window and Colton standing across the kitchen reading it over her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without either of them making anything of the proximity. She set the letter down. "Tom Kendrick," she said. "I'll ride over this afternoon," Colton said. "Mrs. Bergman's documents are already in the box. I'll write to the commissioner's office today, requesting that her case be included in the expanded review scope." She was already reaching for paper. "And there may be others. If the investigation is formal and public, people will come forward who didn't before." She was writing before she finished the sentence. Colton watched her for a moment. Her bent head, the quick movement of the pen, the absolute focus she brought to the work that he had watched develop over 4 months from careful and tentative into something certain and steady. And he thought that he had not known, when he wrote those practical letters to a placement service in Denver, what he was inviting into his house. He had expected competence. He had not expected this, whatever this was. Someone who fit the shape of the work and the place, sortie, place in the particular hours of the day, in a way that felt less like an arrangement and more like something that had always been true and was only now being recognized. He got his coat and his hat and went to saddle his horse for the ride to the Kendrick place, and he left her at the table writing, which was exactly where she needed to be. Outside, the February sky was enormous and pale blue and entirely without clouds, and the snow on the valley floor caught the low winter sun and threw it back in 1,000 directions. And the south pasture, all of it, all 40 acres, stretched out under that light exactly as it always had, unchanged, unhurt, belonging to exactly who it was supposed to belong to. Tom Kendrick got his land back on a Thursday in March, and he did not say much about it. Adelaide had expected, she wasn't sure what she had expected, some kind of moment. Tom was not a demonstrative man, but she had watched him carry the weight of that lost property for months, had seen the particular careful way he held himself when the subject came up, the way his mother's name appeared in conversation whenever the Kendrick land was mentioned, as though the two things were inseparable in his mind. His mother's faith that the papers were worth keeping, and the land itself. He came to the ranch to tell them in person, driving his wagon up in the afternoon mud of early spring thaw, the road still half frozen and difficult. He sat at the kitchen table and Adelaide poured coffee, and he said, "The commissioner's office sent the formal order this morning. The Crow lien is voided. The property reverts." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "My mother cried. She doesn't cry often." "She was right to keep those papers," Adelaide said. "She was." He looked at his coffee. "She wants to have you both to dinner when the road clears enough to be decent." "Tell her we'd like that," Colton said. Tom left after one cup. He was a man who expressed gratitude through showing up rather than through talking about it, and Adelaide respected that. She stood in the doorway and watched his wagon navigate the muddy road back toward Harlan, and she thought about his mother in a rented room above a hardware store for a year and a half, keeping a tin of papers that everyone told her were useless, because she knew what was true, and she had refused to let that knowledge go quiet. There was something in that worth thinking about. Adelaide thought about it for a long time. The formal investigation into Elias Crow's survey work took 4 months in total. Fletcher, the territorial surveyor, came back twice, once in March with a deputy and once in April alone, moving through the county records with the same small handwriting and methodical patience that had characterized his first visit. He did not share findings as he worked, but word moved through the valley the way it always did in small places, through the feed store and the post office and the women's gatherings at the Halverson place. And the picture that assembled itself, piece by piece, over those 4 months was worse than Adelaide had originally calculated. 7 properties. Over 8 years, Elias Crow had manipulated the surveys of 7 properties in Harlan County, always using the same basic mechanism, misreferencing a natural boundary marker that had shifted or exploiting an ambiguity in an old deed's legal description, in ways that systematically shrank the affected properties and freed up land or water access that was then Through various arrangements Adelaide did not fully untangle, made available to parties connected to Crow. The Reeves South pasture had been the most recent, the Kendrick property the most damaging, Mrs. Bergman's son's grazing lease the least documented but still supportable. In May, the Territorial Attorney General's office in Helena sent 2 men to Harlan. Crow was formally charged with official misconduct and survey fraud. He lost his position as county surveyor within the week. He left Harlan with his wife and his furniture before the summer, and the house he had occupied on the good side of town stood empty through the hot months with its curtains drawn, and nobody in the valley talked about him much after he was gone. Because people who have been harmed by someone are often less interested in discussing that person's fate than outsiders expect. They were interested in what came next, in fixing what had been broken, in getting back to the work. Adelaide wrote the formal requests for expanded review scope for 3 of the 7 properties herself, working from the evidence each affected family brought her over the course of February and March. Sitting at the kitchen table with a rotating population of nervous, weathered people who came in with their hats and their document tins and their accumulated years of believing there was nothing to be done, and who left with something different in their faces. Not optimism, exactly, something more cautious than that. The specific guarded hopefulness of people who have learned not to trust good news until it arrives and stays. She was careful to tell them the truth about what she could and couldn't promise. She was not a licensed attorney. She could organize the evidence, draft the arguments, identify the legal provisions. But if any of these cases moved to formal litigation, they would need a real lawyer, and she told them so clearly every time. Most of them nodded and said they understood, and then looked at her in a way that suggested they were going to rely on her anyway, which was both touching and slightly alarming. "You know what you're becoming," Colton said one evening in April, watching her go through Mrs. Adler's documents at the kitchen table. "Don't say it," she said, without looking up. "The Valley lawyer." "I'm not a lawyer." "Nobody out here cares about that distinction as much as you do," he said. She looked up. He was leaning against the kitchen door frame with his arms crossed, not quite smiling, watching her with the particular quality of attention she had learned to recognize over 6 months, the kind that didn't need anything from her, that was just present, witnessing. "My father spent 30 years being the person people came to when things went wrong," she said. "He used to say it was the best and worst job in the world. Best because you could actually help. Worst because you were always seeing people at their most frightened." "What did you say to that?" "I said, I thought frightened people were easier to help than comfortable ones. Comfortable people aren't sure they need anything." She set down her pen. He laughed. He said I was right, but that I should keep that opinion to myself because it would make me sound arrogant. Colton did smile then. A real one. The kind that reached his eyes. The kind she had cataloged carefully over 6 months because they were not common and therefore worth noticing. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was," she said. "He was also difficult and impatient, and he had opinions about everything, and he thought he was right about most of them." She paused. "He was right about most of them. That didn't make it easier to be around." "Sounds familiar," Colton said. She threw the pen at him. He caught it without looking. "Jesag." Spring came to the valley in the particular slow, insistent way of Montana springs. Not the sudden green arrival of eastern seasons, but a gradual, grudging concession from the cold, inch by inch, the snow retreating up the mountain slopes, the creek running high and fast with melt, the ground softening from iron to mud to something that could eventually be worked. The cattle, who had been stoic through the winter in the way cattle managed to be, moved differently in April, something looser in them, a particular bovine ease that Pete identified accurately as optimism. Adelaide put in a kitchen garden. She had planned it since November, sketching it out on paper through the winter months, deciding what was worth the effort in a Montana summer that was beautiful and fleeting and somewhat aggressive about both qualities. Colton helped her turn the ground one Saturday morning in late April, the 2 of them working with spades in the soft earth behind the house, moving in the kind of comfortable parallel that had become simply how they did things, not coordinated deliberately, just naturally, each person knowing what the other was doing and moving accordingly. "You could put it further from the house," Colton said, leaning on his spade. "Get more sun on the south side of the barn." "I know, but I want to be able to see it from the kitchen window." She drove the spade into the dark earth. When I was in Philadelphia, I didn't have anything growing, not even a window box. Gerald didn't like the mess. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. I used to look at other people's gardens when I walked to my father's office. I had very specific opinions about other people's tomatoes. Do you? Colton said. I do. Most people stake them wrong. They wait too long and then they can't manage it. She turned a shovelful of earth. You have to think about what the plant will become, not just what it is. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the patch of turned ground between them. That's true of most things, he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at the garden, not at her, squinting slightly against the April sun, and she thought, not for the first time and with less alarm than the previous times, that she had developed the habit of watching his face in the same way she had developed the habit of reading the sky in the mornings, because both of them told her something reliable about what the day was going to be. Colton, she said, what did you actually expect when you wrote to Mrs. Dunning's service? He thought about it. She had learned that about him. That he thought before he answered genuinely, not as a performance of consideration, but as the actual thing. It took a little getting used to if you were accustomed to people saying the first serviceable thing that came to mind. Someone capable, he said, someone honest, someone who wasn't going to make the house feel smaller than it is. He turned another shovelful. I didn't think much beyond practical, honestly. I'd been alone for 4 years and the ranch needed someone who was going to stay. That was the thing I needed most, someone who was actually going to stay. I almost didn't come, Adelaide said. I had the ticket and the trunk packed, and I sat on my bed at 3 a.m, and I thought, what if this is just another version of the same thing? Another cage with a better view. What made you get on the train? She thought about it. The honest answer was not flattering. I didn't have anywhere else to go. I was out of options and out of money, and Victor was going to make my life in Philadelphia impossible, and Mrs. Dunning's letter said you seemed like a decent man. She looked at him directly. I wasn't coming towards something. I was running from something. I want you to know that. I know that, he said. It doesn't bother you? People run from things for good reasons sometimes. He met her eyes briefly, then looked back at the ground. You stayed. That's the part that matters to me. She stood with the spade in her hands and the April sun on her face and the turned earth smelling of everything that was about to grow, and she thought that this was what it felt like. Not the dramatic version, not the version with speeches and declarations and perfectly timed moments, but the actual thing, the quiet accumulation of days and work and honesty and two people being real with each other in a kitchen and a barn and a county records office and a garden patch behind a house in Montana. This was what it felt like, and it felt like nothing she had ever had before. And it felt, strangely, like something she had always known the shape of even when she had no evidence it existed. She did not say any of that. She drove her spade into the ground and kept working. Summer on the Reeves Ranch was its own education. Adelaide had understood in an intellectual way that cattle ranching was seasonal work with a summer peak, but understanding it in the abstract and living through it were different experiences. June and July were relentless. Long days, the kind of physical work that found muscles she hadn't known she had. The heat coming off the mountains differently than she expected, dry and clean rather than the wet city heat she'd grown up in. She learned to work in the early mornings and the evenings, and to find shade in the brutal middle hours. And she learned that Pete Halverson's capacity for labor was genuinely extraordinary, and also that he was deeply afraid of thunderstorms, a fact he managed by becoming extremely busy at tasks that happened to be near solid structures whenever the weather turned. Bess came by with Caleb, who was 6 months old and regarded the world with the specific, solemn curiosity of a baby who is still deciding what to make of it. Adelaide held him sometimes when Bess needed her hands free and was surprised to find that she was not incompetent at this. That babies, like frightened clients and fractious cattle and difficult legal documents, responded well to being handled with calm and consistency and a realistic acknowledgement that they were going to do what they were going to do. "You're good with him," Bess said one afternoon, watching Adelaide walk Caleb around the kitchen in the slow rocking pattern he seemed to prefer. "I'm systematic," Adelaide said. "He seems to respond to systems. He's 6 months old." People respond to systems at any age. They want to know what comes next. It's reassuring. Bess laughed, which woke Caleb briefly, who looked offended and then went back to his study of Adelaide's collar button. "You're going to be a good mother," Bess said. Adelaide looked up. Bess was watching her with the direct, unguarded affection that characterized everything she did, and there was nothing pointed in it, no implication intended beyond the simple statement. "One thing at a time," Adelaide said. "That's how it always works," Bess agreed cheerfully and reached for her coffee. "What?" The formal commissioner's report on the Crow investigation was issued in late July. 43 pages that Adelaide read in one sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon while Colton was out checking the east pasture fence and Pete had the day off. The report confirmed the fraudulent methodology across 7 properties, validated the boundary restoration for the Reeves South pasture, confirmed the void of the Kendrick lien, and recommended that affected property owners file for damages through the territorial civil court. It also included, in its final section, a paragraph that Adelaide had not anticipated. Commissioner Pratt wrote that the quality and organization of the evidentiary filing submitted by the Reeves Ranch had been, in his assessment, the decisive factor in the investigation's ability to move quickly and comprehensively. He wrote that the pattern documentation in particular, identifying the common methodological error across multiple properties and connecting it to a single surveyor's deliberate practice, had given the investigation a framework it would otherwise have taken months to construct independently. He did not name Adelaide specifically. The filing had gone in under Colton's name because that was whose property it was and because Adelaide had thought, practically, that an official filing from the property owner carried more weight than one from an unnamed associate. But everyone who had been in those conversations knew who had done the work. She folded the report and set it on the table and sat with the particular complicated feeling of having done something that mattered and having it matter in ways she could trace. Not abstractly, not theoretically, but specifically. Tom Kendrick's land. Mrs. Bergman's son's lease. The south pasture running right up to its proper boundary. Elias Crow out of the county surveyor's office and out of the valley and unable to do to anyone else what he had done to 7 families over 8 years. She had not fixed everything. 2 of the 7 affected families would still need to pursue damages through civil court, which was expensive and slow and uncertain. Crow himself had not been imprisoned. The territory's case against him for criminal fraud was still moving through the system with the glacial pace that criminal cases moved at and might or might not produce a conviction. And there were almost certainly things he had done that no documentation remained to prove, harms that had already been absorbed and moved past and would never be formally acknowledged. She had not fixed everything, but she had fixed what she could reach with what she had in the time she'd had to work with. Her father, she thought, would have considered that the correct measure. Colton came in from the east pasture near sunset, tired and dusty, and she was at the table with the commissioner's report and a pot of coffee that had been sitting long enough to be stronger than intended. He read the relevant sections while she poured 2 cups, and when he set the report down, he was quiet for a moment in the way he got quiet when something had landed. "The paragraph at the end," he said. "Yes." "He's describing your work." "He's describing the filing." Adelaide. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the direct steadiness that she had come to understand was not blankness, but its opposite. Full attention, carefully held. "You know what you did here," he said. It was not a question. "I know what we did," she said. "You gave me the documents. You drove me to the records office. You stood in your kitchen while Victor Mercer tried to rearrange the facts of my life, and you didn't move an inch." "That's not the same as what you did." "No," she agreed, "but it made it possible." She picked up her coffee cup. "That's what it is, Colton. That's what we've been doing since October, making things possible for each other." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the summer evening was settling over the valley in long golden layers, the light going amber and then rose over the western mountains, the cattle moving in the far pasture in their slow, end-of-day way. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. He turned his coffee cup in his hands once, a gesture she had learned to recognize as the thing he did when he was getting to the real point of something. "I wrote to Mrs. Dunning's service because I needed a practical arrangement," he said. "That's true. But I also wrote because 4 years alone is a long time, and I knew that, and I was trying to be honest with myself about it without wanting something I had no right to expect from a stranger." He looked at the cup. "What I said in those letters about not expecting love, only a workable arrangement, that was true when I wrote it. I meant it as a fair offer, not a limitation." "I know." Adelaide said. What I'm saying is that it changed. He looked up. Not right away. Not in October or November. But at some point, I can't tell you exactly when, it changed, and I knew it, and I didn't say anything because I didn't want to. Because you'd been through enough, and the last thing you needed was pressure from the person who was supposed to be a safe arrangement. Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. The light was moving through the kitchen window. Evening light, the long kind. I know that too, she said quietly. You knew. Colton, I watch you. I've been watching you since October because I had to know, because I needed to understand who you actually were versus who you were being careful to seem like. That's what happens when someone has hurt you badly enough. You watch. She set her cup down. What I found, watching you, was that you were the same. You were the same person whether I was in the room or not, whether Pete was around or not, whether it was easy or difficult. You didn't change your behavior based on who was watching. You just were who you were. She paused. That's not a small thing. It's actually the thing, for me. He was still. The kitchen clock ticked. A horse moved in the corral outside. I'm not easy to know, she said. I need to say that clearly. I have things that are going to take longer than 6 months to work through. I wake up at night sometimes and the dark is wrong, and it takes me a minute to remember where I am, and that where I am is safe. I get angry in ways that catch me off guard. I have opinions about everything, and I'm not always right, and I know I'm not always right, but it takes me longer to admit it than it should. She looked at her hands. I'm telling you that so you know what you're actually considering, not the capable version, the full version. I know the full version, Colton said. I've been watching you too. She looked up. You think you're the only one who watches, he said, and there was something almost warm in his voice, something that was not quite amusement but was related to it. I watched you read a survey document in my kitchen 2 weeks after you arrived and explain a 15-year-old creek boundary issue in 10 minutes that a Billings lawyer couldn't untangle in 2 months. I watched you hold Bess's hand at 3 a.m. I watched you sit across from Victor Mercer and dismantle everything he brought with him without raising your voice once. He paused. I watched you throw a pen at me last April, and I watched you plant tomatoes and stake them correctly from the beginning because you'd thought about what they were going to become. She laughed. It came out unexpected and genuine, the kind that happens before you decide to let it. The tomatoes, she said. The tomatoes, he agreed. The silence that followed was the best kind. The kind that has something inside it, something warm and real and not performed. Two people sitting with something they have both known for a while and are only now allowing into the open air between them. Colton, she said. Yes. I'm not running. He looked at her. Something in his face that had been held carefully for a long time came slightly loose, not dramatically, not with any theater, just a small release around the eyes and the mouth. The specific expression of a man who has been patient for a good reason and has just learned the patience was worth it. Good, he said. The tomatoes came in by the end of August. Not perfectly, because nothing in a Montana summer is entirely cooperative, and she lost a third of the early ones to a late cold snap that she had not accounted for and should have, and the rest came in at once in the way that gardens do, all at the same time and more than you planned for. She spent 3 days in late August with Bess putting up jars, the two of them in the kitchen with Caleb in his basket in the corner, and the windows steamed with the canning process, talking about nothing important and everything real in the way that women do when they are working together with their hands. And the work itself creates a space where words come easier. You're different than when you arrived, Bess said, not looking up from the jar she was sealing. I'm the same person, Adelaide said. You're the same person, and you're different. People can be both. Bess set the jar in the rack. When you got off that train, Pete told me about it, how you looked on the platform. He said you looked like someone waiting to be told the thing they were dreading. Adelaide was quiet for a moment. That's accurate. And now you look like someone who's got somewhere to be, Bess said. That's the difference. Adelaide thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, thought about the platform in October, the enormous sky pressing down, the careful held breath, the $34 and the trunk of her father's books and the marriage certificate she had not yet decided whether to burn. She had burned it, eventually, in March, not with ceremony, but matter-of-factly. feeding it into the stove on a cold morning while the coffee was heating. It had seemed like the right time. Not because it meant something dramatic, but because it didn't mean anything anymore. And keeping things that don't mean anything is just weight. She thought about who she had been in Philadelphia. Not just in the Mercer house, but before that, growing up in her father's practice. Learning to read deeds and survey maps and the compressed legal language of property rights, being told in various ways by various people that this knowledge was interesting but not entirely appropriate, that it was her father's domain and not hers, that a woman who knew too much about property law made people uncomfortable in ways that were ultimately her problem to manage. She had managed it for years. She had made herself smaller than she was and called it being sensible, and then married a man who expected her to stay that size. She thought about Tom Kendrick's mother keeping papers in a tin, about Mrs. Bergman keeping documents under her kitchen floor for 3 years, about how many women she knew, or had known, who were keeping records of things that had been done to them or taken from them, in boxes and tins and the backs of drawers, waiting for a moment when those records might finally matter. The records mattered when someone knew how to use them. She thought, that is work worth doing. She did not say any of this to Bess, but she thought it clearly, the way you think something when it finishes assembling itself and you finally understand its complete shape. And she filed it away in the same part of herself where she kept the things that were true and useful and going to be needed later. On a Thursday evening in September, after the first real chill of early autumn had come back to the valley, and the cottonwoods along the creek had begun their turn to yellow, Colton came in from the south pasture later than usual, and Adelaide had kept supper warm on the stove and was reading at the table when he sat down across from her without taking his coat off. "I want to ask you something," he said. She set the book down. "I wrote to Mrs. Dunning's service for a practical arrangement," he said, "and we've had that. And it became something else, which we've talked about." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "What I want to ask is whether you'd be willing to make it something official, not the original arrangement, something different, a real marriage, the kind where—" He stopped. "I'm not saying this well. You're saying it fine," she said. "I want to be your partner," he said, plainly. Not in the arrangement sense, in the actual sense. I want what we've been building this year to be what it is. I want you to have legal standing on this property, not as a wife of convenience, but as a co-owner, someone whose name is on the deed alongside mine. I want—" He pressed his mouth together briefly. "I want you to be here because you've chosen to be here, every day, not because the arrangement requires it." Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. She thought about October and the enormous sky. She thought about the document box under her bed. She thought about the staircase and the commissioner's report, and Bess in the kitchen saying, "You look like someone who's got somewhere to be," and her father's voice saying the argument that wins is the one that's still standing when everything else has been knocked over. She thought about what it had taken to get here. Not just the travel, not just the legal work, not just Victor's letter and Fletcher's careful handwriting and the creek boundary and the south pasture. The other things, the slower, harder things. Learning to sleep without bracing for sound. Learning to disagree out loud and not wait to see what it cost. Learning to take up the space she actually occupied rather than apologizing for it. Learning that a person who is consistently kind without wanting something in exchange is not a person who is hiding something. Some people are just that. Some people just are. It had taken a long time to learn that last one. It would probably take longer still to fully trust it. She was not finished with any of this. She suspected she was not going to be finished with it for years, and that was all right. Unfinished was not the same as broken. Healing was not the same as healed. She had learned the difference here, in this kitchen, in this valley, in the year that had followed the worst year of her life. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, because it deserved to be said twice. "I choose this. I choose you. I want my name on that deed." She paused. "I also have opinions about the kitchen shelf configuration that I have been holding back for months, and I think it's time we discuss them." He stared at her for a second and then laughed. A real one. The full kind. The kind she had been collecting all year because they were rare and therefore valuable. And she laughed too, and the kitchen was warm and the autumn was coming in through the window with its smell of cooling grass and turned earth. And outside the cottonwoods were going yellow along the creek that ran exactly where it had always run, along the boundary that was exactly where it had always been. The deed was amended in October, 1 year after Adelaide had stepped off the train in Harlan with $34 and 3 healing ribs and a trunk full of her father's books. Her name went on the record beside Colton's at the county land office. A different clerk than Emmett, a young woman named Ruth, who did the paperwork efficiently and handed them the registered copy without fanfare. Adelaide held the document on the wagon ride home. She did not read it. She knew what it said. She just held it. The valley looked the same as it had the first time she'd driven into it. The long hills, the creek, the mountains pulling the sky down at their edges. The cattle were settling into their autumn positions in the far pastures. Pete had fixed the section of the north fence that had been problematic since spring. The kitchen garden had been put to bed for the winter. The tomato stakes pulled and stored, the earth turned over and left to rest. The woman who had arrived in Montana frightened and purposely small, who had learned to read this sky and these roads and the particular grammar of a life built with her hands alongside someone she had chosen. That woman had done something with the years she'd been given. Not perfectly, not without cost, but she had done it. Her father had always said that the practice of law was not about winning. It was about building something that could hold. A structure of fact and evidence and honest argument that could stand up to pressure from people who had more power and less scruple. She thought that was true of other things too, of marriages and gardens, and the slow, patient work of becoming someone you could actually live inside of. You built it to hold, not because everything was going to be easy, but because the structure was sound, because the people involved were honest, because the foundation was made of things that were actually true. She thought, I know where I am. I know what this is. I'm staying. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. The ranch came into view around the last bend in the road. The barn, the house, the smoke from the kitchen chimney going up straight into the October air, and it looked exactly the way it had always looked, except that now it had her name attached to it in the official county record, which changed nothing visible and everything that mattered. Colton pulled the horses up in the yard. Adelaide climbed down, the registered deed in her hand, and stood for a moment in the autumn light that was doing what Montana autumn light always did, making everything look briefly like the best version of itself, clear and particular and not going to last, which was exactly what made it worth looking at. Well, she said. Well, Colton agreed from beside her. They stood there for a moment, two people in a yard in October, with a working ranch around them and a year's worth of real things between them, and a future that was not going to be simple or perfect or free of difficulty, but was going to be. She was certain of this in the way she was certain of creek boundaries and document patterns, and the sound of the house at night, genuinely theirs. She folded the deed carefully and put it in her coat pocket and went inside to start supper. There are people who will tell you that starting over is the hardest thing, that the courage required to leave what you know and go somewhere entirely new is a special kind of courage, the kind that only rare people possess. Adelaide Mercer Reeves would have disagreed. She had started over. She knew what it cost. But the harder thing, the thing that required more from her than the train ticket and the $34 and the carpet bag and the careful held breath, was the staying. The choosing to stay every morning after the fear had passed and the practical arrangement had become something real and the past had settled into its proper distance. Staying when it would have been easier to leave. Staying when Victor came with his version of events. Staying when she could feel herself getting tangled in old patterns, reaching for old defenses that no longer fit the shape of the life she was actually living. Running takes courage. Everyone agrees on that. But staying clearly, staying honestly, staying as the full version of yourself rather than the carefully managed smaller one, that takes something else. Something that doesn't have a dramatic name, that doesn't look impressive from the outside, that is just the daily work of being where you've chosen to be, with the people you've chosen, doing the things that matter, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. She had learned that here, in this valley, in this kitchen, in a year that had asked more of her than she had known she had to give, she had given it anyway. That was the whole story.